Thank you so much for bearing with us on the So first of all, I want to thank the organizers so much for having me here tonight. I was telling them before I even started all this, my expectation when I published this book was that nobody would read it, and my expectation when this event was organized was that nobody would come. And so it's been this incredibly pleasant surprise just across the board. So really, sincerely, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It means a lot to me. I've already jumped forward to my slides. So I've taught, over the course of my career, I've taught a lot of demos, or I've given a lot of demos, and taught a lot of classes, and inevitably what happens is I do this grand preparation, and I stay up all night practicing precisely what I'm going to say. I have this big outline, and then I get into the moment and just throw it all out. And so I do have really extensive notes here to try and keep myself on track. Hopefully I'll stay roughly on track tonight. You'll have to bear with me if I diverge at points just on kind of how I'm feeling and then the kind of looks of confusion that I'm getting from the crowd. And I might live to regret this, but if you have a question during the presentation, go ahead and throw up your hand. And I might say, hey, we'll get to that in a minute. I might say, actually, I think that's off track. But I would love to have this be vaguely interactive, at least throughout the process. So I guess to introduce myself, first and foremost, I'm Andrew Etter. I lead the technical writing team at Palantir Technologies down in Palo Alto. I have a pretty small team at this point, just 5 fantastic tech writers. And very early this year, I think it was actually the first of the year, I published a book called Modern Technical Writing you can purchase on Amazon. And if you were to do that and actually read this book, you would see that you can read it in about 45 minutes. And I've been allotted an hour for this talk. So you see the problem, right? Everything that I possibly had to say could be distilled down. I could just read it front to back for you, basically. And so what we'll be talking about tonight is kind of a brief summary of the book and the sort of things that I would do to a second edition if I were to write such a thing. So can I get a quick show of hands here? Has anybody actually read this thing? This is fantastic, okay. Yeah, and if you didn't finish it, that's maybe my favorite outcome. if you went front to back, great. If you haven't read it at all, that's fine. Not finishing it, I think is absolutely my favorite. So this is the kind of Reddit-style TLDR here, too long, didn't read. If I just had to sum up the whole book, it comes out to like 11,000 words. This is 12 words, I think. And it kind of represents the really quick loop in terms of how I envision the tech writing process and what I view as sort of a really sensible method for getting documentation out into the world quickly. And this first one here, this learn, is maybe the most loaded word of all. Because at first, if you want to create some documentation, obviously you have to learn your subject matter really well, and you have to get acquainted with your audience really, really well. But the second time through that loop, when you hit that learn section again, now suddenly you have all these incredible things that you can rely on. You have reader feedback, you have bugs, you have support tickets, maybe there's been a new feature introduced. And so the first time is really maybe the easiest time, maybe the least interesting time, and it's subsequent revisions, how you can make that a continual loop of improvement that's kind of interest to me. We can talk about lightweight markup maybe a little bit, but I'll be covering that more in detail later. Essentially, I think lightweight markup is just kind of the most sensible way to write nowadays, and that compared to XML, it's so much faster, and you still end up with valid XML in the end. It's a guarantee. Let's see here. Treat like code. When I say that, I essentially mean that I believe documentation should be stored in distributed version control, and it should be reviewed just like code as well. It should be, you check out the full repository, you fork, you branch, you write your new content, and you submit it for review. And it has to pass some series of tests maybe before it's brought in, maybe it has to go through a style guide. But keeping the stability of the documentation over time really depends on making sure that contributions that do make it into the docs are of high quality. And I've been called somewhat of an opinionated person. I try not to be. I try to have the, at Palantir we say strong opinions weakly held. Maybe we say that elsewhere as well in the Valley. But the idea here is, yes, I have opinions, but I really, really am open to counter opinions as long as they're supported with good evidence. So if there are things you want to talk about after this that you feel strongly about, that you think I missed in the book, I really, really value that feedback, and I'd love to kind of have that conversation. All right, moving right along. So again, to clarify, I have not started on a second edition of this book, and I have, at this point, I have no plans to do such a thing, but this was a thought experiment on my end about the sort of things that I would do for tonight. How would I build on the existing content, and what have I learned in the past year? Because at this point, I wrote this thing late last year, maybe October through November. And so I figured we would start off with a little bit about me. I would talk about the Kindle direct publishing experience in case we have any aspiring authors in the crowd. And then moving into the profession in general, how I view just tech writing as a whole. We can talk more about actual writing, because I think I devoted an entire paragraph to that in the book, about actually writing content. And then project prioritization, scale and performance, migrations, and why Markdown is such a problem. It's kind of the bulk of what I want to cover this evening. And what I would love to talk about, but can't, is internationalization and kind of heavyweight content management systems and how they can ease that process. And the reason I can't talk about them is I just don't know enough on that front yet. That to me is maybe the big scale problem that we encounter if we do our documentation in lightweight markup. But I'd have to do more writing there before I can discuss it intelligently. All right, a little bit about me. As Tom Johnson, does anybody in the room know Tom Johnson? Yes. All right, he's the one who introduced me to all this, and he very politely let me know in his way that one of the things I did a poor job at in the book was establishing any degree of credibility at all. And so I figured I'd start off with a little bit about myself and my background and those kinds of things. I actually grew up in Alaska. That's the fun fact that I tell everybody when I meet them. Born and raised there, ages 0 through 22. And yes, I have been chased by a moose, but that was only once. I got away, it was fine, it's no problem. Basically, my life in Alaska was, I would summarize it as mathematics, sports, and video games were kind of the big thing for me. I played a ton of sports, I really excelled in math, and when I got home, it was time to get on the computer, basic thing. And I've been making websites since I was about 14 years old. I wrote my first lines of Python at either 15 or 16, I'm not totally sure. And I stood up a Linux server in my basement at age 17. And so when you do all these things, and you're good at math, you love computers, well, what does your guidance counselor tell you? They tell you you need to go to school and you need to study computer science. That's kind of the end of it. That was not the path for me. I did do 1 year of computer science at Cal Poly, and then I decided I did not want to be a software developer. Didn't know what I wanted to do, and I went back home to Alaska to study. I bounced around through, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different majors. It was like the downward spiral, right? It was like computer science, this is marketable, and then I was like, well, how about economics, and then business, and then I eventually kind of came down to English. And the reason, and I say this affectionately. Sorry, you're right, I was going the wrong direction. I hear it's different in Australia. So, and the reason that I landed in English eventually is actually because I found it challenging. All through school, I was never ever viewed as a standout writer. I was viewed as a very average writer, maybe above average if I got lucky on an essay or something. And I think the big reason for that is all through my schooling, I thought writing was about eloquence and flourishes and the sort of beautiful prose that all these incredible authors that we read crank out, right? Nobody ever reads just a really well-written email in school. Instead, you're handed like one of the seminal pieces of literature and told, this is good writing. And so I got to college, and one of my professors just kind of gave me the light bulb moment, and he said, good writing is about having a compelling point and supporting it with evidence. And seriously, I had never heard, I was like 21 at this point, nobody had ever told me that. It was just this incredible moment for me. And I started approaching writing in, you could call it a more formulaic way, but really it was just a more effective way. And so I practiced that for a long time and eventually got my degree and moved back to California because that's where you go when you live in Alaska. You get out after you get your degree. Moved back to California, worked part-time as a software tester while I was working on my teaching certificate. And then in an absolute stroke of luck, I was offered a full-time position right as an incredible number of teachers were laid off in California. And so I accepted a full-time job in the software industry, and I've been here ever since. I worked so that was QA for about 2 years. That was full-time as a support and training lead for another few years after that. And then I got hired over at Palantir, and I worked in tech writing before they made a huge mistake and promoted me up to lead there as well. So the support and training gig, I should talk about a little bit. I know we spent a lot of time on this slide, and you've seen probably too much of my face, but we'll keep going. The support and training lead gave me a really interesting perspective into users, and maybe much, much more user empathy than your typical developer has, or your typical tech writer has, because I was actually out teaching classes to these people who just wanted to achieve something with an application. They didn't want to learn the concepts. They weren't interested in me talking about big picture, here's how it can all be tied together. They just had a little something they wanted to do, and the whole experience has been really formative in the way that I approach my documentation. All right, let's talk about writing a book. So the dirty little secret with modern technical writing is that it started out as a wiki page for Palantir. And I wanted something that I could hand to brand new writers that we had at the company and say, here's basically what we do. And I realized after a day or two that it was getting way, way too long, and I was never going to be able to get anybody to read it on a wiki page, and I thought it might have validity outside of Palantir. So I did what I call market research, which is essentially looking at all the books on Amazon, going down to Barnes & Noble, checking these things, and seeing if anybody was even talking about this. I don't have a ton of ego about my writing, so if somebody had done a good job on this already, I was just going to use that and say, you know, everybody, you're a new hire, we're buying this $12 tech writing book for you, and that's that. But I didn't see anything comparable on the shelves, and so I thought, I'm a writer, technically, professionally, I can do this. And so I self-published it on Amazon with the expectation of course, incredible monetary benefits. Not included on this slide is me going to the Palantir legal team and saying, hey, is this okay? And thankfully they were really, really supportive of the whole thing, despite it starting out as, in fact, a company assignment. So let's talk Kindle Direct Publishing. This is, I think, something that hopefully this audience is interested in, so we'll dwell on it a little bit here. The great thing about Kindle Direct Publishing, you retain full control of your work, and the royalties are super generous compared to traditional publishing. The number I hear get thrown around a lot is about 10%. So you sell a paperback book, and maybe it costs $10 and you get $1. On Kindle Direct Publishing, it is either 35 or 70% royalties that you keep. So in my case, it's a $4 book, and I get a cool $2.70 for most US sales. The rules there are really, really complicated though, so we can go over them a little bit. It has to be a work that you hold copyright on, so you can't go get a work out of the public domain and then resell it on Amazon for 70% of the fees. If you do that, you get cut down, I think, to 35% or something. And it has to be sold within a 70% territory, I guess, which means any area where Amazon actually has a storefront. I guess there are some smaller countries where they just send you to Amazon.com or something. And so I think if I make a sale in Luxembourg on Amazon.com, it's like 35% or something like that. And it also has to be within a certain price range, and it has to be 20% cheaper than any physical copy on offer to qualify for that 70%. So the rules there are really, really dicey, but I get what Amazon's doing, right? They're trying to make sure that you're pricing your ebooks really, really aggressively. But either way, right, 35 or 70 doesn't really matter. It compares super favorably to traditional publishing. Yes, sir, my apologies.
Can I buy it on my iPad and read it on my iPad, or do I have to have a Kindle to read it?
No, you can buy it on your iPad,
okay,
definitely.
Cool.
I think if you,
Kindle app.
yeah,
I
I think
think
if
the
you,
reader,
Just put it in your account.
yeah. You do have to do it like from the website though. If you try to do it within the Kindle app on an iOS device, Amazon doesn't want to give Apple their cut of the sale, and so they kick you over to the web browser to actually make the purchase. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So, a brief note here about the Kindle Direct Publishing forums. If you ever get a chance to check these out, they might be the funniest things in the history of the world. I still look at them once every week or two just to see what we're hitting on in terms of the topics that the authors of today want to know. And it's a wide variety of things, many of which are openly consumer hostile, many of which are people who have this incredible idea for a book, but they have no idea how to format it for publication. And as you can see in the upper left, in fact, some maybe more interesting questions that I wouldn't recommend clicking on. So let's focus on the middle one, though. I have and I don't want this to come off as like my father's old, but I have a story about my father I'm going to share here. And he called me up one day and he says, "Hey, Andrew," that's what he calls me. And he said, "Hey, Andrew, I have this buddy who owns a lentil farm, and when you search for his lentil farm on Google, he comes up like number 27. How does he be number 1? And I sort of did this moment briefly, and I said, "Like, Dad, that's not how it works. Google has this incredibly sophisticated algorithm. There's this huge number of companies and people that do work, really complicated work, to try and boost where you fall in that search order. There's no like setting, make me number 1 if somebody puts in this search term." And again, I don't want to make it, haha, my dad, because he's so much smarter than me in so many ways. But I find it really like funny and charming when people stumble upon the fundamental questions of a given area. And so the fundamental question here, how do you get people to buy something that you're selling, right? And because I'm the person up here and we're all listening, I have absolutely no advice on this front. I really don't. I'm not in marketing. I don't do much on social media. I didn't do anything to promote this book. And maybe I should have, maybe I shouldn't have. That's an argument there. But what I can say is that if you have something you feel strongly about, something that you've shown to your friends, you've gotten good feedback on, something you say, "Oh, I think this represents value in the world," or it adds something to the conversation. Like, it was pretty straightforward. It took me a day or two. It's not hard. You can do it. And I'd encourage you all to do it. I think it really is. I really do believe the greatest novel ever is sitting in somebody's cupboard somewhere, sitting in a trunk. Like, get it out there in the world. Don't be afraid to charge a little bit of money for it, and you'd be amazed what can happen there. So let's talk about the Kindle direct publishing experience. This is the sort of incredible diagram you could see if you were to ever read my documentation. Up at the top there under Start, it's labeled Start. It's actually write something in whatever format you deem fitting. And then in my case, I generated the EPUB. There's no reason you couldn't write directly in HTML or in Word or something to get to that generate EPUB section here. Let's see if I can mouse over it or something. I can't. But the problem here is going to appear no matter what you do. So once you have this EPUB that you're happy with, you can test it in any number of readers. The Nook reader is really, really good, but I think iBooks works equally well, and there are some other open source ones. And then you upload that EPUB to Amazon, and that's where the magic happens. And by the magic, I mean the horror. Because what Amazon has missed here, they're a market leader. They really are. They're the biggest bookseller in the world, absolutely bar none. And they give you no way whatsoever to test your book. You cannot test it. To this day, I don't know what modern technical writing looks like on probably any of the devices in this room. And we'll explain that a little bit more. So you upload this EPUB to Amazon, and they transform it into a Kindle book. And then using their web-based previewer, they show you a highly inaccurate preview of what it's going to look like on any number of devices. When I uploaded it the first time and I looked at the iPhone previewer that they had, I was just horrified. I was like, this is unpublishable. What happened? They can't do this. And then when I actually did the item on the far left, which is publish blindly and hope for the best, it was fine. Maybe not exactly what I would have wanted, but it was largely fine. And so this complete inability to accurately test your work before publication leads to a second problem, which is once you buy a book on Amazon, even a Kindle book, an ebook, you own that version of the book forever. So I have uploaded maybe 14 different versions of modern technical writing. I still own version 1. And if I decide on my phone to delete that and download it, I still download version 1 again. They treat it very much like a print edition. That's the metaphor that they're using for all this, is that that's the version you published, and you now own it forever. And so to test newer versions of my book, I would need to delete the book from my account and pay myself $4 again for the privilege of testing. It's really a baffling process. And I went through the same steps because I thought maybe this is just how this works. I went through the same steps with the Apple Store, and it was flawless and wonderful, and I was able to test immediately, and it was no problem at all. And then I promptly removed it because that would cut into my royalties on Amazon. So let's talk about the aftermath here. This is maybe the most surreal screenshot I've taken in my life. To even be near the elements of style is just mind-boggling. And so Amazon does really quick calculations of sales, I've found. So I don't think this is averaged out over a day or even over a week. I think I just barely touched up against Strunk and White, maybe for a couple hours in terms of sales. And then I shot back down to where I belong.
Was your flesh burned?
Exactly, precisely that, right? You sort of go, this is one of the most important style guides, or I guess, writing guides ever written, and there I am right next to it on the Amazon store. So it's been, I think I'm at something like 4.5, 4.6 stars, over 14 reviews. I've gotten that treasured orange bestseller banner a few times, and that never gets old, I promise. And I can tell you, sales-wise, in fact, if you can move 10 books a day, you are very likely a bestseller, right? That's it. And you go like, 10 books a day, that's nothing, but that's 10,000 books every 3 years, is what that adds up to over time. And so, I have not sold that many books, by the way. And so what happens is, I guess, when I first published this, I had a really great joke for a few months. And I was able to say, yes, I published this book and I can almost go see a movie by myself. Or I published this book and like, congratulations, I can go out to dinner by myself. Or like, okay, now I can bring my wife, but she can't order dessert. Or something like that, right? Like I had all these great jokes, and then as the numbers got larger, it stopped being funny. But I can tell you, even now, I still think it's only worked out to a little bit above minimum wage, all told, given the number of hours that I put into it. And over time, I trust that will hit Bernie's minimum wage and then maybe a little bit more over time. But, if you had any thoughts to yourself like, okay, this is a really lucrative gig, I need to get into self-publishing, let me dispel you of that. Keep your day job. I promise it's more profitable. In terms of other nice things that have happened, I've received 0 hate mail. And anytime you do anything on the internet, you get hate mail. Like, that's like a guarantee, and I've got none. But I have gotten some really nice messages from folks in Ireland and Pakistan and New Zealand, like just nice people saying nice things. So it's very surreal for the internet, basically. And very few returns. Nobody seems to feel like they got ripped off. It seems like the $4 price point was about right for what people were getting. So that's great. And also seeing what people have highlighted in your own book is this really cool thing that I think folks who publish to print will never really get or understand, right? They can go down to the used bookstore and they can open a copy of their own book and they can see a highlighter, but being able to look at a passage that I wrote and say 27 people highlighted this, like that's fantastic feedback for me to know in the future if I ever do the second edition. Don't cut that sentence.
Are there any other analytics that you get about it?
Only really sales analytics is the problem, right? It's what did you sell and to whom in which country kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Do you get completion rate, like who actually gets to the end?
Kind of. There is the, if anybody here has ponied up the money to Amazon, you might have Kindle Unlimited, which is you can just check out as many books as you want because you paid this flat fee. And so I do get to see how many pages were read, but that's done Google Analytics style, so it's not 4 people read this many pages, it's 127 pages were read in June or something like that. All right, and I do have, since we're talking about big questions tonight, like the big question my father asked, I have another big one for everyone that I'm not going to actually try and answer up here, but it's, if I had published this book for free on Medium, people do that all the time, they publish things longer than what I published here, would I have gotten anywhere near the exposure that I received for this? And so the question there is then, what effect does putting a price tag on a digital good have compared to distributing it for free? And conversely, what effect is taking a price tag off of a physical good have there as well? And is there any correlation? Is there any interesting relationship there? For example, people go absolutely bananas when IHOP offers free pancake day, right? It's pancakes, what are they, $6? Like, but people go nuts. But on the other hand, if you tell me that a sushi bar is offering a free tuna roll, I want nothing to do with that. Keep that away from me. Like, no. And so there's something, I think the opposite effect with digital goods, right? Where when you give it away for free, there's this assumption that it's just something you've thrown out into the sea of the internet and it's probably no more valuable than anything else. But just by putting a modest price tag on something, it really changes the public's perception of it. So again, going back to what I said earlier, if you do have an idea that you think is valuable or interesting, don't be afraid to slap a price tag on it. You might be surprised. All right, let's talk technical writing. We're done with the book now. This, for me, is kind of the interesting question that I've done for all of my jobs throughout my career, which is, why am I employed? I like to ask that question. Why does this company even have me in the building? The answer is usually, but in this case, with tech writers, we do need to answer this, right? Because so many of the people we work with are fluent in English, they're well-educated, they're well-read, they have great subject matter expertise. So what do we bring to the table that they don't, right? Why are we let in the door? Why don't testers or developers or product managers just write the docs, right? And the answer is, well, it's really hard actually, and we do it because we're best at it. So let's talk a little bit about that. This phrase here, differentiated value add, is one that my boss said. I hope he watches this, by the way. It's one that my boss said about a year ago. He said, I want to know your differentiated value add. And I kind of bobbed my head until I figured out that he meant, what do you do that no one else does? Cool, I can answer that question. And so consistency was maybe the big one for me. And when I talk about consistency, what I mean is consistency in tooling, because if you were to let people self-select around a company, right, there's 17 dev teams at your company, and you say you all need to write your own documentation, they're all going to pick their own tools. And they're not necessarily going to be interoperable with one another. One of them's going to have search, one of them's not, the other one's going to look different. Some people will write markdown, restructured text, some people will break out doc, but it can be a disaster. And so having this team that can be sort of the tastemakers around a company and say, this is the way we're doing documentation here, and here's why, that's super important to have a team devoted to this. The accountability one is maybe a little bit coarse, so I'll just come out and say it. You have to be able to fire somebody for doing a bad job. And I don't know if there's ever been a developer who's been fired for writing bad documentation, right? So if you want to keep the bar of docs high at your company, you need to hold somebody accountable for that. And that's why dedicated technical writers make sense. Writing and curation is kind of the obvious one, right? Writers produce a lot of content, and also they need to look over content that other people produce, curate that, make sure it's on target for the audience, make sure the style's right, make sure it's well targeted. And finally, culture. This one's a little more nebulous, but to me, having dedicated writers around makes everybody else around them better writers. It makes them more cognizant of precisely what needs to be done. So the actual writing, this is the one that I said I neglected earlier. I happen to like second person present tense. I think it's very immediate, gets you right into things. Even for things that will happen in the future, right? That if you click this button, you will. I want to cut that will right there and say, if you click this button, the dialog opens, right? It gives it a real immediacy. It's very quick to scan and read, and it's also much easier to internationalize rather. We work in tech, so I do have kind of a special soft spot or sore spot, whatever you want to call it, towards being inclusive. And so I hate the he or she terminology. I hate having to choose a gender for all these things. And so wherever possible, I would much rather just turn everything into plural and say, when users do something, as opposed to when a user does something, he or she will see. When users do something, they see, right? We can't always do that, of course. Sometimes you do get yourself into kind of an awkward situation there, but you can usually rework the sentence as opposed to defaulting to that sort of, unfortunate third person. And then this last one, arbitrary style decisions. I have to be really clear on this one. I just don't care. I can't care. I don't care if it's email or e-mail, right? It doesn't matter to me. What does matter to me is that you standardize on something and then add the unacceptable form to your profanity filter. Just there you go, and you're done, right? E-mail will be no more in your documentation. It's done. There's just so many more interesting things to focus on, as opposed to precisely how you're going to choose something here that I really bias towards. Just make the decision really quickly, add it into your testing, and let's move on with our lives, all of us. All right, let's talk benefits here. My wife thought this was a pun on Big Ben. Benefits, Ben. It's not actually Big Ben. Had to burst her bubble. And the reason this image is up here is because all of the benefits here really boil down to time, right? Great documentation shortens installation, shortens configuration. It helps people accomplish their goals more quickly. It increases product adoption, which is huge. It increases upgrade frequency, which is maybe the biggest one if you've ever worked with engineers, because there's a reason that Microsoft gives away Windows 10 or gave it away. There's a reason that Apple gives away their latest operating system. And it's that having people on legacy products is a nightmare from an engineering perspective. And so having great docs makes people feel more confident in upgrading to these things. It also makes new hires useful more quickly, and it reduces the need for direct product support. So again, time, right? It's this precious resource, and if you're working at a company, you want to be sure that I don't know what it is, I wrote down 2,000 hours of work per year, roughly, that we all put in, right? That amount of work needs to save people 2,000 hours of time in order for it to be valuable that you are at the company. So, alternately, of course, some people are employed in writing documentation because it's a line item in a contract that says this application must have documentation, and that's all there is to it. But even then, the person writing the contract is operating from the assumption that your work is going to save people that much time, that including that line item for $100,000, that will save a corresponding amount of time, if not more, once it finally arrives to customers. Cool. This is something I've said once or twice in kind of a pithy way, but it's actually really held out for me as kind of an axiom for tech writing. And it means exactly what it says, right? It's we don't have all the time in the world to focus our priorities. And so we need to focus on the things that are actually going to matter long term. And so if you can go 6 months with something, like maybe pick another assignment, say, hey, why don't we work on this thing over here? It's going to be valuable for a year or more. The other ways I approach project prioritization, this is all things being equal, right, for all of these considerations that I have here. But all things being equal, I always prioritize the back end over the front end. The back end is typically more complex. It doesn't have a user interface to help people along. It's more foundational to the entire product. And so it typically requires documentation more so than the front end. 1.0 is greater than 0.1. That's me saying I would rather document a mature product than an alpha, right? If developers have produced an alpha and they want documentation or else nobody's going to use this, I typically have to say, look, like, we only want to engage with you once your product has hit the level of additive changes as opposed to transformative changes. Again, we don't always have that. There's the unmentioned line item here, which is my boss told me so, and then you do it, right? But having a really solid project prioritization strategy lets you push back on that a little bit. Team size is big because it indicates corporate investment in something. So if a team's only 3 people versus a team of 13 people, you probably have a good idea of where to place your docs resources and say, hey, this one, no matter what my boss says, this one's clearly more important to the success of the company because they're throwing so many more resources at it. And then analytics are really big. The problem is they don't exist typically for new projects. And so you just kind of have to make a judgment call there. And finally, meta projects. These are projects that are not related to anything in particular, but that benefit the doc set as a whole. So things here would be like improvements to the website that hosts the docs or better search optimization. And often these can take priority over existing other projects within the company. And that's because, again, they benefit the doc set as a whole. And so you can either build out this narrow slice of the documentation, or you can do something that helps everybody. So, All right, here's my team. I'm really, really good with Photoshop, so I'm sure you can't notice the person who I inserted in there. So we have within my team, we have something we do, which is whenever somebody's out of the office for some reason, we go out and we grab either ice cream or milk tea or something like that, and then we all take a selfie and we send it to this person who's not there. And we always tag it, having fun without you. And so in all of these photos I have of the team, I never actually have the entire team. I'm always missing one person. And so that's what's going on there. In terms of the people that we look to hire at Palantir and the sort of people that I think make really fantastic technical writers, we're looking for fast learners, people who have a really strong baseline technical foundation. And this one might be counterintuitive. We look for good writers, not great writers. If you're a great writer, fantastic, that's wonderful. But we look at writing as long as you have the basics there and you're a fairly good writer, that we can build you into something better over time, versus trying to build up somebody's technical foundation has proven really, really challenging for us. And so that's typically what we've gone for. Right now, we have, I want to say, 2 computer science majors, a theoretical physics major, and then a couple English majors, and 3 comp sci majors, for kind of the outlay of skills that we've got on the team right now. But in terms of interviewing, we're really, really open to people of all disciplines, strictly because we haven't seen a super strong correlation between any particular major and being a great tech writer. So if you are interviewing out there and somebody's resume comes across your desk, if they seem to have the right skills, don't be put off by the biology major or whatever you might see. Would be my advice there. Yes, sir.
When you say a strong technical background, what exactly are you talking about?
So, so much of my book here is specific to the software industry. So in this case, I do mean strong technical background in software. So some knowledge of the web, networking, databases. Hopefully they can use the terminal a little bit. Hopefully they can write a for loop, things like that. Yes, sir.
Well, what do you do to improve people's writing skills? So, you've got somebody who comes in and they can write like an engineer.
Sure.
What do you do to help them write like a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. It is ruthless code reviews every time they submit something into our source control system. When it comes into, we use GitHub Enterprise, but it doesn't matter. Garrett and Stasher, they all provide kind of the same functionality. Yeah, making sure that things are up to scratch before they get merged in.
So you don't just have people write and have the technical people review it and then publish it. You actually have editorial stuff going on within your team.
Absolutely, yeah. And especially if somebody has shown themselves to be a little bit newer to the profession. Like if I have a really experienced writer, I'll just say, hey, get that engineer to code review it for you. If I have a newer writer, I'll say, hey, get the engineer to review it for you, but also tag somebody on the team and have them take a look at it. And it's not meant to be, this fist pounding them down as they submit stuff that isn't up to scratch. It's meant to be, let's try and boost this person's level of writing until they get to the point that we think they can just do their own work. All right, we can talk about lightweight markup a little bit, shift gears here. Lightweight markup is, again, I had to write it out in full here. It's a great way to make websites, simple ebooks. If you want to make PDFs and complex ebooks, it's fine. And if you're looking to make posters, pamphlets, magazines, it's an awful way to write. Don't do it, because so much of the work there would be the CSS. But it's 2016, and I know this is not a good form of argumentation. People say it's X years, so therefore we should do something. But it's 2016, let's try and make websites. And so I think lightweight markup is the easiest way to get from a pleasant writing experience directly into HTML or XML. In terms of tools for making print docs, if you do want to go down that path, the O'Reilly people have a tool chain called Atlas that is used to publish many of their books. And most of their books, or I shouldn't say most, a good number of their books, to my understanding, are written in ASCII doc. And then they run through this Atlas publishing tool chain to actually end up as printed books. There's also a really popular one nowadays called Gitbook that spits out a nice looking website that's kind of book formatted, but also apparently print documentation. And then I personally use a tool called WK-HTML to PDF to spit out PDFs of the docs when I have to. But in actuality, none of these are really fantastic tools. They're just, we want to make great websites, and this happens to give us a way to make okay PDFs. If your focus really truly is on making beautiful print documentation, lightweight markup is probably not there yet for your needs. But if you are doing that, I kind of have to ask why. Why is the focus print documentation right now? And should it be for your company going forward? All right. Yes, sir.
Maybe you're going to get to it, but could you explain exactly what you mean by lightweight markup?
Sure. The most illustrative example I have is just Markdown. But this is lightweight markup. I define as any text-based language that processes to clean XML or HTML. And it does that based on any number of kind of, I think people usually call it like humane considerations. So like something indented by 4 spaces, that's a block quote. And you don't have to wrap in block quote tags because you've indented it 4 spaces, and so the processor knows. Likewise, putting something in backticks usually marks it as code, that kind of thing. Yeah, we'll have code samples up actually later, so we can all be horribly bored by it. Cool. So I think we're actually getting a lot closer to time than I was expecting, so we'll kind of start blazing through a little bit. So this is the old way that we worked when I first started at Palantir. We had a big team. We used FrameMaker on Windows. We stored those files in Subversion. They were binary files. And we spat out PDFs that then got processed into a web-based help system. Right? Does this sound familiar to anybody? Can I get a little? Okay, cool. And bugs were very much like cold cases in this instance because only writers could make changes. So even if somebody saw a problem and they wanted to fix it then and there, they had to go into Jira, they had to type up a bug, they had to provide a link to the thing, and then we had to go in and open it up and establish context and say, what the heck happened here, go talk to the developer again, and it was this huge hassle. The new way of doing things, we actually have a smaller team, but we're managing more content than we ever have before. And the reason for that is that anybody can contribute, since we're doing lightweight markup now. You can use any editor, any operating system, although I think most folks use Atom on a Mac, if you're interested in options there. Everything's plain text, so in terms of the code review, it's really, really straightforward and pleasant, versus code reviewing XML is a disaster if anybody's ever had to do that. And at this point, and this is maybe the most incredible thing of all for me that I never would have predicted before we made this change, we receive more PRs than bugs, and not by a small amount. It's something like 5 PRs for every 1 bug that gets reported to us. For the most part, people are fixing their own problems. Yes, sir?
Pull request.
Sure, a PR is a pull request, which is somebody saying, hey, I've made this change to the documentation, would you like to accept it? And the other thing that is really maybe not super relevant in a corporate environment where we're throwing money around, but it's all free. It's open source software, text editors are free, the tools to build these websites are all free. So in terms of tools, like I talked about earlier, this is just an example of the tools you might use to produce docs using this format. And I'm not here to advocate for any particular tool set because I've got a completely alternate tool set here that will do the job just as well, right? That's the point here, is that we don't lock people into an operating system, we don't lock people into tools, you can just use whatever you're comfortable with. The only thing I will include a special plug for is OneNote, because I think it's the greatest application ever. It's from Microsoft, it lets you organize your notes into books, sections, and pages, and it all syncs up over the cloud. It's fantastic, I can't recommend it enough. Moving on to scale. This is something that I've heard a little bit. People have talked about this. They say this approach doesn't scale. Like, what if you have 20 writers or 30 writers or 50 writers? This doesn't scale. And it does, it really does. And so when people talk about scale, it's kind of a nebulous term. So let's approach it from a few angles and see kind of where the criticism actually lands flush. In terms of it doesn't scale to some number of contributors, this is the same approach the Linux kernel uses, and they have thousands of contributors. It scales to people and contributors, no problem, right? get scales to massive file sizes, so if you decide that you want to use distributed version control, you can do it with a pretty high degree of certainty that it's going to scale to your needs as a documentation writer. The Read the Docs project, which is associated with this group here, I checked, I don't know, a month or two ago, and they had 34,000 projects that were all built using the same system. And at Palantir, we have 180 projects that are all managed by a single machine. And so performance isn't even a problem, right? This is all kind of solved. And if performance really is a problem for you for some reason, a really remarkable new static site generator just came out. It's called Hugo. And I watched a video of it processing 5,000 markdown files in something like 7 seconds. It's really remarkable. So if people aren't talking about the actual performance or the number of files or the number of writers when they talk about scale, there are some spots where scale is a legitimate concern. And one of them is Markdown, and one of them is internationalization. Markdown does not have such useful features as variables or conditional processing of its text, or even simple things like really rich tables. And so if you have a giant doc set that uses tons of variables or that could benefit from tons of variables, suddenly when you have 8,000 markdown files, things start to get really, really dicey in terms of keeping that up to date over time. And internationalization is the other big problem where I'm positive that at a certain point, whether it's 5 languages that you're translating into or 50 languages, that it starts to make sense to use a more heavyweight system to manage all those translations. I don't know precisely where that falls, but I'm pretty confident that at a certain point you need tooling that is more robust than this to handle it. So if I've sold you in any way, shape, or form after reading the book, you're hearing this talk, and you decide, I want to migrate over to this. I want to do it. I want to take my company's existing docs and get them over to lightweight markup. There's a fantastic tool called Pandoc that I recommend in the book that is kind of the Swiss Army knife of text formats. And so it will take in an XML file and spit out a markdown file. It'll take in an HTML file and spit out a restructured text file. It'll do all those things. The problem is the translations or rather the conversions are almost never perfect, and so you're going to have to do some manual cleanup after the fact. That's where regular expressions come in. There's a joke from, I think it's an old Netscape engineer from way back in the day, and he said, some people, when they're presented with a problem, they say, I know, I'll use regular expressions. And now they have 2 problems. And the reason here is that regular expressions are from the first generation of computing. And so if you think of them as kind of charming antiques that can do the job you're looking for, you can get over the incredible frustration of having to actually use them to achieve something. And so I use an online tool called regex 101 to actually verify that my statement has any validity at all. And then I take things truly incrementally whenever I'm doing a migration. I branch, I commit, I do a small change, I check the diff and I see, okay, it looks like it did what it was supposed to, and then I commit again and I move on. Because writing a single giant regex that just cleans up all the docs in one shot is just madness, and I don't recommend it. Again, regular expressions, it's something that we could talk about all day. It's the subject of a talk all its own, so we'll just move on. This third line here, git checkout -b migration. This is, if you did grab something that you're looking to migrate, throw it into a Git repo, check out a new branch, and this always gives you an easy way to reset your progress if you do something horrifying to it. If the regular expression doesn't do what you were looking for, or Pandoc doesn't do what you were hoping, you can always reset to kind of the state that you were in previously. And then these 4 here, the table of contents, cross-references, variables, and tables, these will give you the most problems, I guarantee it. And the reason is so few of them are standardized across these various doc formats that we have, especially cross-references and the TOC. And consultants exist for this. They are fairly expensive, but if it comes down to having the team do something for a month versus just hiring a consultant who knows what they're doing to handle it, it might make sense to throw some money at the problem. Yes, sir?
This is exactly what I'm trying to do with my job right now. I've got 460 data files, and I've used Pandoc to convert them to Markdown, but now to get them to work in Jekyll, I need to insert headers and take out all the junk.
Precisely.
So now I'm trying to learn sed, and bash to run through them with the regular expressions and pull all that stuff out, sort the headers and so on.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's pretty challenging if you're not used to
Absolutely.
scripting and so on.
Yeah, I think and the problem is I don't have any great advice for you. I think the only one I would say is ditch sed.
Oh, really?
And just use the find in project function of your favorite text editor,
Oh, really?
which will achieve kind of the same thing. It'll let you do it over a bulk number of files, but you don't have to include the crazy sed-xr, you know, whatever flags to get it to do what you're looking for.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's really the only.
Since this is a one-shot deal, I'd rather not have to go through all that learning the scripting and everything else.
Exactly.
Because once it's all converted, I'm done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And a text editor can save you at least from sed.
Okay, I'll try that out, thanks.
Cool, let's talk Markdown, because it is a problem in the industry right now. The big problem is maybe its greatest attribute as well, that it's super feature limited. And what this means, again, is that as your docset scales to a huge number of files, Markdown starts to show some really serious problems at the seams. In terms of the features I've identified that it needs most, we're talking about variables. So being able to, in your Markdown file, include a couple brackets and say today's date or version number or something like that, and have it just populate on build. Cross-references are really just self-healing links. You can think of them that way, where you mark an arbitrary point in one document, you point to it in another, and now even if you move that file around or change its name or something like that, at generation time, the hyperlink goes to the right place. Includes would be really nice to have. Includes let you embed a file within another file. So within a certain file, you can say, hey, include other file.markdown. It's a really nice thing. And conditional processing is huge as well in my mind. Conditional processing lets you have certain portions or entire files that get blocked off as being, say, internally your company, whereas other portions you would mark external, and then you can generate 2 copies from one source. And the thing is, RST, restructured text, and ASCII doc do these things already, right? And so you go, well, why is Markdown such a problem? Just use one of those. That's a fair question. So the problem here really with using ASCII doc or RST is that people don't want to. And I can't emphasize that enough, right? People don't want to do this. They don't want to learn something new. They already know Markdown. They've used GitHub before. They don't want to learn these other languages, even if they do things that Markdown doesn't do, right? And so what that does immediately is it knocks down your contribution level, maybe from, let's say, 60% to 20%, because people don't want to learn a new skill. And so you have fewer people contributing to the docs of your company. That's a problem. You say, okay, let's improve those languages, ASCII doc and RST. Let's make them more Markdown-like. Well, anybody who's followed the Python community at all has seen the rift between Python 2 and Python 3, where in Python 3 they actually went back and tried to correct some of the things they regarded as mistakes, to the point that they actually changed the print function. That's how basic they got with these changes. And I think it's been almost a decade now, and still nobody's writing Python 3, right? Once you have this mass of content in a given programming language, or in this case, in a given markup language, people don't want you to change the basic syntax. That's a huge pain for them. They have to redo all their content. And so in this case, I really think the best solution is just to extend Markdown. We have this core syntax that people like. Let's ramp it up and give it some features that we actually need to do our jobs. Cool. Let's do some code samples. How much time do I have here? 3 minutes. We can do this. So here's some Markdown. And right here we can see a whole lot of things that we would like to change about this file. This is a really contrived example that I have, but let's run through it really quickly. 3.8, I would love to replace that with a version variable. Up at the top where it's the link to the new API section, I would love for that to be an auto-generated table of contents that I can just throw at the top of my document. This warning block here, why is that not in its own div? I've just bolded the word warning and added a colon. Like, I'd love to have a full pull-out div in my resultant HTML, just a block that says this here. And then this link here, I would love to turn that into a cross-reference. For more details, see this link that will break if that page ever moves. And finally, I have a snippet here that I had to copy and paste from somewhere else because it was important to this document and I couldn't just embed it, right? And so we can fix these problems if we use something like Jekyll. And here's what it looks like in the end. And the problem here is, I think we can probably agree, this is barely better than just writing an XML or writing an HTML, right? You see, I added a comment to the very top of the file, and the syntax there is horrifying. I've added the version, but it's wrapped in these double curly braces. The table of contents that I've inserted isn't even a Jekyll feature. That's like Jekyll's default markdown parser's special feature that it has and nobody else has. So if you ever wanted to port this to a different system, it would just be a disaster. Finally, I did have to as well actually insert inline HTML, just have a warning block. And then you can see here at the very bottom, I had to do this crazy if Jekyll environment is external, include this useful snippet, otherwise I exclude it, right? It's a disaster, and in the end, it won't look that way. It'll come out as a Jekyll site, and it'll look really nice, but you, on the other end, are having to deal with source files that look like this. And if you ever decide you want to move over to something like Hugo, something like, I don't know, I mean, all the static site generators of the world now use Markdown. And if you ever wanted to move to another one, you'd have to rework all of your files, which is just crazy to me. So let's talk about my version of Markdown. My boss asked me to do this after he heard me gripe about it for about 2 solid weeks. He said, why don't you sit down and write down an expanded Markdown spec where you think the language needs to go? And I said, Brian, I'm not going to code it. Like that would take me forever. And he said, no, just write it up. I want to see what it would look like. And so this is kind of my vision for where I would like Markdown to go. And it essentially means taking Markdown-like syntax and adding those features that I think are missing. So at the top, I've used CSS-style comments to do a block comment. I think most people will probably get that. I've inserted variable in a very Markdown-like way, ditto with the talk, and I've extended that notion of the triple backtick code block to include things like warning blocks, and also conditionally includes and excludes at the bottom there. So if anybody's a developer and they're interested in coding something up, let me know. And I will happily send you the entire spec. All right, we got through it in time. Do we have other questions here before we conclude? Yes, sir.
So I write documentation for an open source project. And how do you educate community members who are PRs on proper documentation and writing things up to your specs?
Sure. Is this project hosted on like GitHub or something like that?
Yeah, it's Kubernetes.
It is, okay. Yeah, that's, it's a big problem, it really is. And GitHub doesn't make it especially easy because they have the notion of forks, right? Where somebody has this fork that they have total permission over. And so even if you wanted to, you can't go in and correct their work. You have to ask them to correct it. Or say push it and then I'll correct it later, which is maybe even worse. So yeah, I mean, it's a really hard unsolved problem, especially in open source where you have no power over these people, right? In a company, you can say, well, I'm the docs lead, my name is Andrew Etter, and you will write to my standards. But in open source, it can be really, really challenging. I don't have a good answer there.
Do you deal with that at all?
I do not. We do have some open source at Palantir, but for the most part, the people contributing to the docs there are, in fact, Palantir employees. Yes, sir.
Just the last thing you mentioned there with your Markdown spec. There are other versions of Markdown that I wonder if some of those authors would consider would be open to some of this. There's one called Multi-Markdown, which has support for things like includes, and then GitHub flavored Markdown is becoming more and more popular. So I wonder if somebody there would be willing to incorporate some of these.
Yeah, that actually extending GitHub flavored Markdown would be kind of my dream because. Actually, I'm not sure what, I mean, Jekyll is using Cramdown, which I think is largely compliant. Multi-Markdown, really, really solid. The only problem there is it's written in C, which means that it's highly unlikely to be included in any of these Ruby or Python-based static site generators that are out in the world. But yeah, functionality-wise, you're absolutely right. Multi-Markdown is certainly the closest to kind of what I'm looking for here. And yeah, I would love to extend GitHub Markdown. Yes?
How do you see where you're going with this as different from something like ASCII-Doc with ASCII-Doc?
Sure, it's not necessarily any different. It's just building on a core language that people already like. as opposed to convincing people to adopt a language that they're not familiar with or happy with. Does that seem reasonable?
Well, I'm working on a fairly large project, and I had been working in restructured text, which didn't render tables properly. And I have a huge number of tables that I needed to have work seamlessly, and so I converted everything with Pandoc over to ASCII-Doc and started using ASCII Doctor. And to me, I mean, the developers I'm working with, they don't mind coming in and adding to the files. They don't see it as much, at least these developers don't see it as much different from working in Markdown.
Sure, yeah.
It's easy for them to pick up and understand.
Yeah, we use restructured text at Palantir, which, again, we get a lot of that pushback, right? Why aren't we just using Markdown when we're writing in Markdown? And so it is always a challenge, but it's the same reason that you had essentially was we want to use features that Markdown doesn't have or doesn't do particularly well.
Yeah. But ASCII-Doc, the reason, so there's another thing that we're doing is pulling API reference content from Swagger, and there's a Swagger to ASCII-Doc utility,
Absolutely.
you know, and it got that whole thing working really well. So, you know, there's some nice things. So, anyway,
Definitely.
it seems like there are lots of options, and this looks interesting too. I mean, it'll probably go somewhere.
I hope so.
Yeah.
How'd you culturally cross the chasm from doing things the old way with the heavy hitting tech hubs tools into doing this lightweight stuff? Because I'm stuck with, you know, big ass flare docs,
Yep.
and I'm working it, and this looks very appealing, but I'm a sole practitioner at this point. I need to be able to jump straight into it, produce results, you know, and I guess what I'm wondering is if you have any heartening anecdotes about how you made that jump.
Yeah, I think really, again, you're not gonna like this. I think all I really have are disheartening anecdotes.
Okay.
We had, in our transition period, we actually went from FrameMaker and then to Flare, and then finally we landed on Sphinx and restructured text. So I'm intimately familiar with Flare, and it has a number of really fantastic features, but even getting people to go from Frame to Flare was a huge deal at the company and led to a massive amount of dissatisfaction. And it was an equally challenging, if not more so, jump over to Sphinx and restructured text. It's so much of it is personality, right? You have some people who are really open to this kind of thing and trying something new, and there are other people who are going to be very, very set in their ways and just are not going to be interested in this whatsoever. And so trying to bridge that any way you can, I don't have a great answer there. Yes?
But going to these technologies allows developers to contribute.
Correct.
On the writing side, I guess you review what they write. I mean, do you find that they get better as time goes on? Do you have to intervene less? I mean,
yeah, they really do. It's been remarkable, the number of contributions we get from people and the quality bar, how it's raised over time. Especially, you have these folks, I guess, who they were really, really strong writers in college, and then they got out into the workforce and they just stopped using it. They started slapping together all lowercase emails or something. But when you start holding them to that bar again, it's a muscle, right? It comes back over time, and they really do learn how to use it in a higher caliber way.
are most of them native speakers of English?
They are indeed.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
It seems like with the style of writing that you suggested, the second person, present tense, etc., that because it's fairly kind of crisply delineated, good writing versus not good writing, that even a non-native writer would eventually be able to adapt without much of a problem.
It's yes and no.
Is there a more stylistic
yeah.
kind of
Yeah. It really depends. We have some non-native English speakers who do fantastic work in our docs, and we have some other folks who really do struggle. It just depends. But yeah, at least I think you make a really great point that sticking to present tense and keeping it fairly short and crisp does help people avoid those sorts of weird verb problems that they might encounter. Definitely, that makes a lot of sense to me. Yes.
So I found that mediocre writers lose credibility quickly with great writers and just engineers in general. So what is that incubation period like when you get somebody that has strong technical skills, but they're a weak writer. Like, how do you on-ramp them and train them so when they're putting work out, people aren't dismissing them if they have poor writing skills?
Sure. I guess that's something that I just don't accept from the team, at least from my team, right? That this person has taken the time to try and contribute something to the docs. Like, why in the world would we shame them and let them lose credibility for that? Like, they're doing us a favor. And a new writer, it's the same way, right? We hired this person for a reason. We think they're really smart and we think they are teachable. In terms of poor writers losing credibility with developers, I haven't really seen that. I guess I can imagine a poor writer losing credibility with the writers, or somebody who's not technically savvy losing credibility with the devs. But I haven't seen a poor writer lose credibility with devs. That hasn't really been a problem, I don't think. Does that answer things at all?
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been different, where engineers are very blunt, and so they'll say, why do I need this writer if I write as well as them?
Sure.
So when we put our work out, we make sure that it is as good as possible, as close to perfect, so we get that credibility where they like trust us, and that when they come to us for help, we write docs, it's going to be at a level of professionalism that's higher than what they can output.
Yeah, I can definitely imagine if we did have an employee who I saw that happening with, saying, hey, before you push anything out for developer review, come talk to somebody in the team, get an actual in-depth style and writing review before we even talk to the engineers. I can imagine that being a good strategy there, but hasn't been too big of an issue. Yes.
If you're starting out from scratch, kind of what would you think would be like the best tools to use?
If I had to do it all over again, I would probably still use restructured text with Sphinx. If I had a developer at my beck and call, I would probably do some customized version of Markdown with maybe Hugo or Jekyll. They're both good. Yes.
I have a number of ideas. What do you do with your group to make technical writing interesting? Most books you read, technical books, are pretty goddamn boring. It seems to be the rule, you know. And so I have some ideas on how to do this. I've been doing this a long time. But what do you do? What do you tell your team about trying to make it interesting? I mean, you can go through all the style guide and all this stuff, but I'm asking a very different kind of question. So do you deal with that or not?
Only in examples, really, I would say. So we still want the prose to be fairly, whatever you want to call it, crisp and professional.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like an example data set within the documentation, maybe we would do something that shows a little bit of fun, right? You open it up and maybe it's all the caregivers or something, right? Like, at least injecting a little bit of personality that way. But we don't really do it in the prose itself.
I guess since we're in a group, my thinking is that there's another skill set which I call think Hollywood. In other words, write a book, okay, which I recently did. Write a book, but then step back and how to write it from a story point of view. There's a story point of view puts it together. And that skill set, because of course most technical writing books are written, just throw the fact. And after the sixth fact, everybody's asleep and nothing connects. But if I write, we'll call it a use case, call it Think Hollywood storyboard, it kind of all works together. And that to me makes it, but that skill set is very different because you've got to, now that you understand it, now that you write, now you've got to sit back and say, okay, how can I put this in a way that pulls it all together? And that's a different skill set, and very few books, and I kind of a lot of them, do any of that.
Yeah,
They don't do any of that. And that's why when you read, it's like, God, I can't take this. And it's true with online courses too. After they throw the fifth fact at you or show you the 20th feature, it's like, hey, Psych 101. People don't get it after the fifth feature, guys. So that I think is going to be the frontier of kind of our field. Is one of the ways is this whole use case or what I call Think Hollywood approach.
Sure.
Can I address this point?
Certainly.
Yeah, you should look at the Salesforce Trailhead material. I've seen some demos that they've done.
Yeah.
They have a narrative format, a very informal, casual style, and a gamification interface that walks you through the training you're doing there.
Yeah.
It goes to what you're talking about,
Yeah.
and it might be something you might want to look for.
Some are doing, but very few.
Sure. Yeah, we have a writer on my team actually, who's right there in the back. You can throw your hand up, Sarang, who takes a great deal of pride into trying to weave a narrative into his documentation that kind of takes you on, I don't want to say a journey, but at least start to finish, right? And so you might be interested in speaking with him afterwards as well.
No, I've done it. I don't need to speak to anybody.
I didn't want to talk to him
Basically,
either.
all you have to do is like write a screenplay. I mean, it's the same kind of thing.
I think we have a question.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I've got a bunch of slides on slide shares on this topic. One is called The Technical Writer's Trip to Hollywood. Another is A Writer's Theory of Everything. And I have a few other sets of slides, and maybe I'll present next year if you guys want me to.
Okay.
I gave a lightning talk, but yeah, so I've gone into detail of how to do this.
How many of your team from kind of the old days of frames and flares and markdown have you actually retained? Because I know you've scaled down considerably. Do you have to?
Well, I should say that myself and one other writer.
But it's kind of inevitable that if you're drastically changing tools, that there has to kind of be.
I don't think so. I don't think the changing of the guard had so much to do with the change in tools, but it would be disingenuous of me to say that it was not a contributing factor.
Okay.
Certainly.
How many people did you have in your big team in the old days?
It was 10.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? Perfect. Let's get me out of here. Thanks, everyone.